The second week of June 1944. A replacement infantry lieutenant moves his platoon 2 miles inland from the Normandy beaches. The flanking element runs right, only to smash into another impenetrable wall of vegetation. There is no open flank. There is no room to maneuver. Soldiers tried desperate, improvised methods. An infantryman would run through incoming fire, climb onto the sloping back deck of the moving tank, and beat frantically on the turret with the heavy wooden stock of his rifle. He hoped the commander inside would hear the metallic banging over the engine noise and open the top hatch. If the commander actually unbuttoned and raised his head to speak, he instantly became a prime target for German snipers waiting in the high branches of the oak trees. Officers and tank commanders died by the hundreds attempting this simple act of battlefield communication. This mechanical barrier paralyzed both elements. The tank would not fire its main gun into the dense brush because the crew did not know where the American assault teams were hiding. The infantry would not advance because the tank could not suppress the enemy strongpoints. The combined arms team was severed. They occupied the same physical space, bleeding in the same mud, but they were fighting completely separate, disconnected wars. The infantry had adapted their movement, but that adaptation meant nothing if they could not harness the power of their armor. They needed a way to talk to the tankers instantly, clearly, and safely. The solution would not come from the engineers in Washington or the planners in London. It would come from mechanics tearing apart discarded equipment right on the battlefield, looking for a single wire that could pierce the steel hull. Within 60 seconds, the platoon is pinned flat against a shallow ditch, taking casualties from an enemy they cannot even see. The solution began with a spool of copper wire and an empty steel ammunition box. Behind the lines, in the muddy maintenance parks, scattered just inland, from the beaches, signalmen and mechanics began hacking into the standard equipment. They understood the fatal flaw of the Normandy battlefield. The tank's internal intercom system was designed solely for the 5 men sealed inside the hull. The infantry outside carried the EE-8 field telephone, a heavy canvas bag containing a handset connected by miles of wire to rear command posts. The frontline mechanics simply decided to splice the 2 isolated systems together. They ran a length of communication wire from the tank's internal radio terminal, feeding it down through the ventilation louvers or empty pistol ports, and routed it out to the back deck of the vehicle. They welded an empty .30 caliber ammunition tin to the rear armor plate, just above the engine exhausts, to act as a weatherproof housing. Inside this crude metal box, they placed a standard infantry telephone handset. It was a remarkably simple, unauthorized modification. It bypassed the rigid military supply chain and rewrote armored doctrine with a soldering iron. The impact on the battlefield was immediate and violent. When an American infantry squad was pinned down by invisible machine gun fire, a soldier no longer had to climb onto a moving tank. This was not an isolated failure. Across the entire American front line in the weeks following D-Day, this exact scene played out thousands of times and beat frantically on the turret with his rifle. Instead, he crouched low behind the heavy steel tracks, shielded entirely from the enemy crossfire. He popped the latch on the welded ammunition box, pulled out the handset, and squeezed the trigger. Instantly, his voice bypassed the deafening roar of the engine and rang directly into the leather headset of the buttoned-up tank commander. The blind machine finally had eyes. The infantryman, peering through the tangled brush, became the tank's external spotter. The commands were sharp and precise. A private huddled in the mud could calmly instruct a sergeant inside 30 tons of steel to traverse the turret 20 degrees right, elevate the 75mm gun, and fire high-explosive shells directly into the root cluster at the far corner of the pasture. The tank crew no longer needed to see the target to destroy it. They only needed to act as a heavy artillery piece for the infantrymen holding the wire. As word of the modification spread rapidly from platoon to platoon, maintenance crews worked through the night to wire every tank they could reach. The infantry micro-teams and the armor were finally fused back into a single, cohesive fighting unit. They could coordinate suppressive fire, eliminate the hidden German strongpoints, and secure the open pasture. The deadly geometry of the interlocking fire, the United States Army had built a massive, highly mechanized force designed for aggressive mobility. Its tactical manuals assumed warfare would take place in relatively open terrain, was being systematically dismantled by the brute force of a directed cannon. But destroying the defenders in one field only solved a fraction of the tactical nightmare. The American advance still had to physically move forward. The Sherman tank now needed to cross into the next pasture. When a driver applied the throttle and forced his tracks up the steep, root-choked earthen bank, the front of the tank pitched violently toward the sky. The main gun pointed uselessly into the clouds, unable to fire at anything on the ground. Worse, as the vehicle crested the wall, the thin, unarmored steel of the tank's belly was completely exposed to German anti-tank rockets waiting in the shadows on the other side. They had learned to talk, and they had learned to shoot, but they still could not breach the ancient walls without committing mechanical suicide. The Sherman tank was trapped by basic physics. When a driver tried to force 30 tons of steel over a steep earthen wall, the tracks bit into the soil and pushed the nose of the vehicle violently upward. The tank would slide up the bank, exposing its thin, unarmored belly to the adjacent field. A single German rocket, fired from the shadows, could easily pierce this weak point and ignite the ammunition stored beneath the floorboards. If the tank somehow survived the crest, it then slammed down violently on the other side, where superior numbers, motorized transport, and rapid flanking movements could overwhelm a static defense. Pre-invasion intelligence officers had analyzed aerial reconnaissance photographs of the Normandy interior, often burying its gun barrel deep in the dirt. The armor could not climb over the hedgerows, it had to go straight through them. Commanders initially requested heavy bulldozer blades to clear paths, but the transatlantic supply chain could only deliver a handful to each division. Ramming a standard tank into a 4-foot wall of packed earth and dense roots merely resulted in broken transmissions and thrown tracks. The curved cast steel front of the Sherman was too blunt. It needed teeth to bite into the wall. The solution came from the very defenses the Germans had built to stop the invasion. Scattered across the sands of Omaha and Utah beaches were thousands of jagged steel anti-landing obstacles, commonly called Czech hedgehogs. They were constructed from massive, thick steel I-beams, designed to rip the hulls out of Allied landing craft. Ordnance units and maintenance companies realized this abandoned metal was a massive, untapped quarry of high-grade steel. They began dispatching transport trucks back to the coastline to drag the heavy obstacles inland to muddy field workshops. Working around the clock under canvas tarps, mechanics fired up oxyacetylene torches. They cut the heavy steel beams into sharp, pronged tusks. Using portable welding kits, they fused these massive steel teeth directly onto the front transmission housings of the Sherman tanks. The adaptation became known as the rhino cutter. It fundamentally changed the physics of the breach. Looking down from 10,000 feet, they saw neat squares of farmland divided by dark green lines. The analysts assumed these lines were like English hedges. When a rhino-equipped tank accelerated and rammed into a Norman hedgerow, it no longer slid up the face of the wall. The heavy steel tusks dug deep into the packed earth, locking into the ancient root systems. The driver then applied maximum throttle. Driven by raw horsepower, the steel teeth sheared through the heavy wood and compacted dirt. The tank gouged a massive hole straight through the barricade. Crucially, the vehicle remained entirely level. As the tank burst through the dirt and thick foliage, its 75mm gun remained pointed directly across the new pasture, ready to fire instantly. Its vulnerable belly armor remained safely hidden behind the lower half of the earthen bank. Instead of an impenetrable obstacle, the hedgerow became a door, and as the tank smashed through, it left a gap wide enough for the specialized infantry micro-teams to pour through the dust and falling earth, immediately fanning out into the next field with their rifles ready. The adaptation was rapidly scaled. Within a matter of weeks, frontline maintenance battalions had salvaged enough beach scrap to outfit hundreds of tanks across the American sector. The military machine had effectively built an industrial assembly line in the middle of a battlefield, turning German coastal defenses into the precise tools needed to dismantle their inland fortress. The infantry could now survive the open ground. They could talk instantly to the armor. The tanks could tear through the ancient walls without exposing their weak points. Thin rows of ornamental bushes used to keep livestock from wandering. Planners believed a Sherman tank could roll right over them. The tactical mechanics of the assault had been entirely rebuilt from the ground up, but fighting one field at a time was still a localized, exhausting brawl. To shatter the German defensive line completely, the separate pieces had to be synchronized on a massive scale, and to coordinate that kind of overwhelming assault, American commanders needed to map an enemy they still could not see. The Rhino tank solved the immediate obstacle. The Welded field telephone solved the immediate crossfire. But a battalion commander standing in a command tent miles away was still functionally blind. Looking at his topographical map, he saw only identical green squares. To plan a deliberate offensive, he needed to know where. The German reserves were pooling, where their mortar pits were entrenched, and where their heavy anti-tank guns were camouflaged 3 hedgerows away. Traditional ground reconnaissance was essentially suicide. A scout patrol attempting to slip through the dense brush would inevitably trip an interlocking kill zone. If the Americans could not see through the earthen walls, the intelligence had to come from the sky. It arrived in the form of the L-4 Grasshopper. It was a light, unarmed Piper Cub aircraft, built of doped fabric stretched over a metal frame. Powered by a 65-horsepower engine, it cruised at a sluggish 90 miles an hour. It looked like a fragile toy, yet it became one of the most feared tools in the American infantry, and an infantryman could simply push the branches aside. When the boots finally hit the ground, that illusion shattered. The pilot and the artillery observer in the back seat flew dangerously low over the bocage, armed only with a map, a pair of binoculars, and a radio. For the German defenders on the ground, the slow-moving plane presented a terrible dilemma. If an 88mm anti-aircraft crew or a hidden machine gunner opened fire on the fragile aircraft, they might shoot it down. But the muzzle flash and the ascending tracers would instantly reveal their perfectly camouflaged position to the entire American front line. If they held their fire to remain hidden, the observer overhead would spend hours slowly circling, studying tire tracks in the mud, freshly broken, branches, or unnatural variations in the foliage. The German gunners were forced into paralysis, hiding silently beneath netting, while the grasshoppers methodically mapped their invisible fortress. But the aircraft could not see everything. The thickest oak canopies entirely shielded the deepest bunkers and the narrowest firing slits. The final layer of observation still had to come from the men bleeding in the dirt. Forward artillery observers, carrying heavy field radios and miles of wire, embedded themselves with the infantry micro-teams. To see past the immediate pasture, these men took extreme risks. They climbed into the upper branches of the ancient trees, growing out of the earthen banks, strapping themselves to the trunks. From 50 feet in the air, Peering through the leaves, an observer could finally see the layout of the adjacent fields. The American military machine, designed to sweep across continents, ground to a bloody, crawling halt. Divisions were fighting for yards, measuring daily progress in shattered trees. When the infantry below took fire, the system synchronized. The forward observer in the tree would estimate the coordinates and radio the heavy artillery batteries, waiting miles behind the lines. The heavy guns would fire a single white phosphorus shell. A brilliant column of white smoke would bloom above the German position. The grasshopper circling above would immediately see the marker, confirm the exact location of the enemy trenches, and radio-precise mathematical corrections. Within seconds, a massive, concentrated barrage of high-explosive artillery would saturate the German strongpoint before the defenders could retreat. The isolated, blind infantry squad was no longer fighting alone in the dark. A continuous loop of intelligence now flowed from the private in the mud, to the spotter in the canopy, up to the plane in the sky, and down to the rhino tanks and heavy artillery. The separate pieces of adaptation had been wired together into a unified method of warfare. The question was whether this grassroots machinery could survive being tested on a massive scale. To find out, the Americans prepared to throw this new system against the heavily fortified city of Saint-Lô. The intelligence loop was complete, but a theory is only as good as its execution. In mid-July 1944, the American army launched a massive offensive toward the ruined city of Saint-Lô. This was not a localized patrol. This was a divisional-scale test of the newly forged tactical machinery and casualty reports. The training was not just inadequate, it was actively getting men killed. Moving as a traditional 12-man squad made them a concentrated target. The terrain leading to the city was some of the densest bocage in Normandy, heavily fortified by veteran German paratroopers, who had spent a month perfecting their interlocking kill zones. The assault began not with a blind infantry charge, but with the methodical precision of the new system. High above, Grasshopper aircraft identified the German mortar pits. Forward observers strapped in the canopy adjusted the coordinates. Heavy artillery shattered the German rear echelons before the ground attack even stepped off. Then came the armor. Instead of grinding to a halt in the sunken lanes or exposing their vulnerable bellies by climbing the earthen walls, hundreds of rhino-equipped Shermans accelerated. The heavy steel tusks slammed into the ancient roots. Driven by raw horsepower, the hedgerows simply ruptured. The moment the dirt settled, the combined arms teams executed their violent choreography. As the tank burst through the wall, it remained level, its main gun immediately firing into the far corners of the field. Crouched safely behind the steel tracks, an infantryman held the welded field telephone, calmly directing the turret toward the hidden machine gun positions. Simultaneously, the specialized infantry micro-teams poured through the newly breached gap. They no longer tried to flank in wide textbook formations. They flooded the pasture, using the tank's heavy suppressive fire. He carries a standard field manual in his pack, the culmination of doctrine tested in the open pine forests of Louisiana and the rolling plains of southern England. Attempting a wide flank exposed them to crossfire from adjacent fields. The infantry on the ground realized quickly that they were not fighting in agricultural pastures. To creep along the drainage ditches and systematically clear the surviving defenders with rifles and grenades. What had been a slow, agonizing crawl in June became a brutal, mechanized rhythm in July. Breach, suppress, clear, advance. The American divisions began chewing through the landscape. The interlocking fields of fire that had paralyzed the invasion force were dismantled one geometric square at a time. From the German perspective, the battlefield had suddenly and fundamentally changed. For weeks, their static defense had worked perfectly. relying on the Americans to blunder into pre-sighted crossfires. Now, their heavy hedgerow walls were being violently torn open. The American armor refused to expose its weak points, and the infantry refused to present large targets. The German commanders could see the devastating results, but they were powerless to counter the mechanism. Their defensive doctrine required time, static positions, and an enemy willing to play by the old rules. The new American rhythm denied them all three. More critically, the German military structure in Normandy was rigid and top-heavy. Tactical changes often required approval from high command, miles away, and completely disconnected from the reality of the front line. An improvised field modification, like welding scrap metal to a tank without official blueprints, was largely alien to their strict industrial and military culture. They were fighting inside a sprawling, segmented fortress. To understand why the most well-supplied army in the world was suddenly paralyzed, we first have to look. Furthermore, they were suffering from a massive logistical strangulation. They could not replace their shattered anti-tank guns or their lost veteran gunners. By the time St. Lo finally fell on July 18, the impenetrable fortress of the Bocage had been comprehensively broken. The American army had adapted and survived, paving the way for the massive armored breakout of Operation Cobra. But solving the tactical puzzle of the hedgerows reveals a deeper historical truth about the force that achieved it. If the solution to the Normandy stalemate was simply a matter of welding scrap metal and splicing communication wires, how did a massive, rigid military bureaucracy actually allow its lowest-ranking men to rewrite the rules of war in the middle of a battle? The American military of 1944 was a machine built on mass production, standardization, and rigid supply chains. Yet, when its fundamental infantry doctrine shattered against the hedgerows, the entire system did not collapse. It adapted at a terrifying speed because of a cultural mechanism that the German high command simply could not replicate. The United States had drafted an army of mechanics, farmhands, garage tinkerers, and factory workers at the physical reality of what they were facing. The Norman hedgerow was not a simple plant, and it was not a mistake of nature. These were men who had grown up fixing broken tractors in the field, hot wiring engines, and improvising mechanical solutions without waiting for an engineer's official blueprint. When the textbook failed in the first week of June, survival required immediate, practical insubordination. Privates spliced unauthorized wires. Sergeants broke apart carefully designed squads. Maintenance crews dismantled steel beach defenses without asking permission from logistics officers in Washington. The brilliance of the American command structure in Normandy was not that generals invented these solutions, but that they recognized their value, stripped away the bureaucratic red tape, and scaled them industrially. When a cavalry sergeant named Curtis Coolin demonstrated a working rhino cutter to his commanders, they did not court-martial him for destroying government property. They ordered the ordnance battalions to build hundreds of them immediately. The question of the Bocage was never really about how to cut through dirt and roots. It was about the speed of institutional learning. The American army functioned as a decentralized, grassroots machine, where a mechanic covered in grease and mud could invent a modification that reshaped the entire theater of war within weeks. But that mechanical and tactical triumph carried a devastating human aftertaste. These adaptations were not developed in a sterile laboratory. The new rules of war were written entirely in blood. It was an ancient structure that the defending army had turned into a perfect killing zone. Every failed flanking maneuver, every blind tank charge, and every rigid adherence to the old doctrine had been paid for by the first waves of infantry who stepped blindly into the interlocking fire. The men who finally figured out the deadly geometry of the hedgerows were simply the ones who had survived the slaughter of the early fields. Think again of a replacement infantry lieutenant, arriving at the front lines, not in June, but in late July. He steps into a damp pasture that smells of crushed apples and cordite. But he no longer expects the war to look like the mock battles of Louisiana. He no longer carries the standard field manual in his pack. He has already learned that the book is worse than useless here. He does not look for a wide, sweeping flank. He does not order a 12-man wedge to cross the open ground. He looks at the thick, earthen wall ahead, listens to the heavy, idling engine of the Sherman tank waiting in the mud behind him, and watches his men execute a grim, precise choreography. A 19-year-old private crouches safely behind the steel tracks, completely shielded from the enemy machine guns. The soldier reaches into a rusted ammunition tin welded to the hull, pulls out a black telephone handset, and speaks calmly directly into the steel. To understand the trap, you must look closely at the physical composition of a single Norman hedgerow. The tank surges forward, its jagged metal teeth ripping the ancient roots from the earth, the infantry flowing into the breach right behind it. They had survived by leaving the old rules behind in the dirt, relying instead on the mechanics under the canvas tarps, the artillery spotters in the trees, and the riflemen crawling through the ditches. They had built a new way to fight out of scrap iron, copper wire, and raw human endurance. It is not merely a row of bushes, it is an earthen rampart. For well over 1,000 years, local farmers cleared heavy stones from their pastures and stacked them along the boundary lines. Over centuries of wind and rain, dirt packed tightly into these stone barriers. Trees, dense briars, and thick vines grew out of the top, weaving their heavy roots down through the soil and rock like iron rebar in poured concrete. By the summer of 1944, a typical hedgerow bank was 3 to 4 feet thick at the base. He knows the mathematical formula of American infantry combat: 12 men to a squad. When the unit takes fire, it often stood 4 to 6 feet high before the vegetation even began, topped by another 5 to 10 feet of dense, tangled canopy. Between the fields ran narrow, sunken dirt lanes, worn deep into the earth by centuries of farm carts. These lanes acted as ready-made communication trenches. The German defenders did not need to pour concrete bunkers. The terrain provided a prefabricated, interlocking fortress stretching for hundreds of square miles. German infantry doctrine was built fundamentally around the machine gun, and their officers knew exactly how to maximize the geometry of the bocage. When setting up a defensive line, they rarely positioned their primary weapons in the center of a hedgerow facing forward. A center position offered a limited view and exposed the gunner to direct return fire. Instead, they dug their MG-42s deeply into the heavy earth at the far corners of the field. From a corner, a gunner had a diagonal view across the entire open space. By placing a gun at each opposing corner, the defenders created intersecting or interlocking fields of fire. When an American unit stepped into the open pasture, they were not shot at from the front. They were subjected to a devastating crossfire from the sides. The automatic rifle team immediately drops to suppress the enemy. The maneuver element loops wide to the left or right, finding the exposed flank. This defense was layered. Behind the hedgerows, German mortar teams had already measured the distance to every open pasture, gate, and road junction. They pre-registered their coordinates. The moment the interlocking machine guns forced the Americans to drop to the ground, the mortar crews dropped high explosives directly onto the pinned men. The geometry of the field had turned into a mathematical kill zone. If an American squad somehow survived the open ground and crawled to the base of the enemy hedgerow, they found no relief. The defenders often dug deep, narrow firing slits through the thickest roots right at ground level. They fired through the base of the wall, remaining completely invisible beneath the dense brush above them. The Americans were fighting a blind war. In the daylight, They could not see muzzle flashes through the heavy foliage. The sharp cracks of the rifles and machine guns echoed erratically off the hard earthen walls, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint the source of the fire by ear. The fields themselves were small, sometimes only 100 yards across. The standard American tactical maneuver required physical space to establish a wide flank. Here, there was no space. Attempting to flank a position simply meant clawing over another earth and root wall. It is clean, it is predictable, it has worked in every mock battle he has ever fought. He steps into a pasture, only to stumble blindly into another pre-calculated crossfire in the adjacent field. The geometric perfection of the defense meant that simply pouring more troops into an attack only increased the casualty rate. The traditional 12-man rifle squad, moving as a single coordinated element, was too large to hide and too slow to cross the open gaps. The math of the standard field manual was leading directly to systemic failure. If moving as a unified squad meant certain destruction, the surviving men at the front had to find a new way to cross the deadly open ground. The geometric perfection of the German defense relied on a specific assumption. It required the Americans to present a target large enough to justify revealing their hidden firing positions. The standard 12-man American rifle squad was exactly that target. To survive, the men bleeding on the front line realized they had to dismantle their own doctrine. Pre-invasion training dictated that a squad leader controlled his men through visual hand signals or shouted commands. But inside the claustrophobic confines of a Normandy pasture, surrounded by the deafening roar of mortars and the continuous tearing sound of machine gun fire, the grass is damp, the morning air heavy with the scent of crushed apples and cordite. Ahead lies a line of thick green vegetation. Command and control evaporated. A sergeant could often only see the 2 or 3 men huddled in the mud directly next to him. The sheer density of the vegetation severed the traditional chain of command. Captains and lieutenants lost control of the battle the moment the first shot was fired. It became a war managed almost entirely by corporals and privates. Out of sheer necessity, veteran non-commissioned officers began ignoring the manual. They stopped moving their squads as a single, bulky formation. Instead, they shattered the 12-man unit into improvised, highly specialized micro-teams. Each tiny element was given a single, violently focused task. One element, usually built around the heavy firepower of the Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, would anchor itself at the base of their own hedgerow. They did not look for targets. Their only job was to fire continuous, suppressing bursts into the suspected enemy positions on the opposite bank, forcing the German defenders to keep their heads down. Under the cover of that noise and flying dirt, a second team, often just 3 men armed with M1 Garands and fragmentation grenades, would begin to move. They did not stand up and charge. They low-crawled through the damp knee-high grass or slipped single file down the shallow drainage ditches at the very edge of the pasture. Suddenly, a single burst from a German MG-42 machine gun rips across the field. The sound is a mechanical tearing, firing 1,200 rounds a minute. They abandoned the textbook idea of a wide, sweeping flank. Instead, they focused entirely on creeping toward the exact corners of the field where the German machine guns were entrenched. By breaking the assault down to a handful of men dragging themselves through the dirt, they denied the defenders the concentrated targets they needed. The micro-teams moved like water, seeking the smallest blind spots in the interlocking fire. Once this small assault team finally reached the base of the opposite hedgerow, the fight became brutally intimate. Standing inches from the earthen wall, they would lob grenades blindly over the dense canopy, or fire their rifles directly into the narrow firing slits hidden in the roots. It was an exhausting, terrifying method of combat where progress was literally measured in feet. This localized, grassroots adaptation allowed the American infantry to survive the deadly open ground. By decentralizing their movement, they proved they could reach the enemy without being erased in a single volley. But this created a new, massive problem. Surviving the crossing was only half the battle. Reaching the earthen wall meant the infantry now had to physically clear the adjacent field and continue the advance. 3 men with rifles could silence a machine gun, but they could not. The American lieutenant acts exactly as his training dictates. He orders his base of fire to drop and shoot back. He signals his flanking element to sweep right, punch a hole through 4 feet of ancient, root-choked dirt and stone. To actually break the hedgerow line, the infantry needed the overwhelming firepower of heavy armor. But as they quickly discovered, calling a 30-ton Sherman tank into the tight, sunken lanes of the bocage was about to introduce a completely different kind of nightmare. The infantry micro-teams had learned to creep up to the earthen walls, but they could not stay there. To push the attack into the next pasture, they needed high explosive firepower. They needed the 30-ton M4 Sherman tank. In theory, combined arms doctrine paired infantry and armor into an unstoppable machine. The tank provided a mobile steel shield and a 75mm cannon. The infantry walked alongside, protecting the heavy armor from hidden anti-tank squads. In the vast training grounds of the United States, this relationship was fluid, synchronized, and deadly. In the sunken lanes of Normandy, that relationship instantly broke down. The Sherman was not built for crawling blindly through narrow, dirt-walled corridors. It was engineered for speed and open maneuver. When a tank rolled into a confined pasture, the deafening roar of its engine and the mechanical screech of its steel tracks announced its exact location to every German defender within a mile. But the doctrine instantly collapses. The base of fire cannot see the enemy. They are shooting blind into a solid wall of leaves, roots, and earth. It did not act as a shield for the advancing troops. It acted as a massive iron magnet, drawing fire from hidden Panzerfaust rockets and camouflaged artillery. For the infantry, standing near a buttoned-up tank in a tight hedgerow fight often meant being caught in the explosive blast radius. The root of the tactical failure was a severe mechanical disconnect. To survive the incoming fire, a tank crew had to close and lock their heavy steel hatches. The moment those hatches slammed shut, the crew went almost entirely blind. The driver and the gunner were forced to view the battlefield through narrow glass periscopes, inside the claustrophobic confines of the bocage, where visibility was already reduced to a few dozen yards by thick foliage. These small viewing slits were virtually useless. The crew could see only a fraction of the terrain directly in front of their tracks. They could not see the hidden firing slits at the base of the wall. They could not see the anti-tank teams creeping along the adjacent tree line. Inside the hull, the 5-man crew was also deaf. The grinding of the transmission and the constant roar of the engine completely drowned out the chaos outside. The infantry huddled in the mud outside knew precisely where the enemy machine guns were hidden. They could track the tracer fire whipping through the wet leaves, but they had absolutely no way to pass that vital visual intelligence to the blind machine idling right next to them.